our speaker, Deb Griffiths. She is a parent of 3 boys in the Centennial School District. Frustrated with the loss of educational opportunity for her children, she spent time researching why our schools continue to struggle financially. She soon became a parent advocate and chair of Centennial Legislation Action Committee, a community group that advocates at the state capitol on educational issues. She is currently the Director of Communications and Community Outreach for Schools for Equity in Education, which is more commonly known as SEE. She has a passion for assisting parents and community members to advocate for their children and their schools, which is why she's here tonight. And SEE is an association of 58 school districts throughout the state of Minnesota, including Northfield, Faribault, Owatonna, and Cannon Falls, to name one of the closest to this district. SEE works for greater equity and adequacy in public education funding and policy for all Minnesota public schools. So welcome to Deb. Thank you for coming to Northfield tonight.
People might choose to stay home, so thank you very much for coming out. I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk about a little bit about SEE, Schools for Equity. Like Tina said, we are 58 Minnesota school districts, and our districts serve 250,000 Minnesota school children. That's 1/3 of the school population. There's a couple common characteristics that tend to bring our districts together, and the first is that our student demographics are such that they tend to be fairly homogeneous. So when it comes to state funding and categorical aid and the complexity there, because we don't have a lot of kids that fit into certain categories, we get the very minimum in state aid. And the other common characteristic that brings our districts together is we tend to be property poor. Now that doesn't mean everybody in our districts are poor. What it means, if you add up the commercial, the industrial, and the residential real estate, our districts tend to fall way below average. And what happens then is if we struggle to pass referendum to make up for that inadequate state funding, because the tax burden falls more heavily to the voting public, they don't have the help of a Mall of America or Rosedale or Medtronics to kind of help shoulder some of those referendum costs. But regardless of that, we really do believe that every child should have access to a high-quality education regardless of where they live. And when I found out that this was what SEE works for, I was really surprised, because coming from the knowledge that Minnesota is the education state and we're nationally recognized, I would have thought this was the way it is. And unfortunately, right now, it's the way, well, it's utopia. We're not there, and that's very unfortunate. But what do we work for? Equal access to a quality education for all Minnesota students, regardless of where they live. We want to see legislation that ensures an equitable distribution of resources. Now that doesn't mean everybody gets the same thing. It means everybody gets what they need so that our kids can meet state and local academic standards and that they can meet their full potential. We want a property tax system that's fair and provides equal access to their referendum revenue for low property wealth districts as well as high property wealth districts. And accountable is a word, when I'm down at the Capitol, I hear accountable all the time. We got to hold our schools accountable. We got to hold these people accountable. I really like to see our elected officials being held accountable for adequate and equitable funding and policy that enables our kids to succeed. And what I work for, too, is this educated and engaged community, parents, grandparents, business leaders, everybody who really grasps onto the fact that our highly educated workforce is what's going to bring about Minnesota's prosperity. In fact, my background comes from being more of a parent than ever being involved in schools. I never was a teacher or administrator. I was a mom. And when I sent my 3 boys off to Centennial School District, I said, okay, Centennial, my husband and I, we're going to continue to parent these people, but I want you to give these 3 boys the quality education that they need and deserve. And because I like to be involved, I did the PTA stuff, like some of you in the room, and I'd sign up to run our fall fundraisers because, man, we could make a lot of money in our elementary school selling candles, candy, and wrapping paper. And then they said, well, we should do something else in PTA, so let's do a bingo night. And I went, okay, I'll run that, because, it's a fun family event, and we can make money. And then I realized, man, I am really money motivated. But in addition to that, I did learn that no matter how hard I worked at that level to raise funds in our elementary, I couldn't stop the cuts that were happening year after year because we could not pass a referendum. into that referendum campaign, and I found that it was really a ridiculous way to fund our schools. I mean, we pit our Save Our School folks against our No New Tax folks, and we pit a generation of folks that said, you know, that education that I got was good enough for me against our students for our school today, who are going to be facing this 21st global economy that we couldn't even imagine a generation ago, or even in our generation. So it's an unfortunate way of funding schools, but we have to live with that. But because we had failed our referendum for 4 times in a row, we were starting to get very, very desperate. And through that effort, our levy campaign had gathered 650 email addresses. And at the end of the 3rd failed referendum, they said, you know what, we're going to start a legislative action committee. And anybody who's interested should come to this informational meeting. And when that email came across my computer, it just stopped me in the tracks. Because that legislative word just popped out at me. And I thought, you know what? Maybe all that work that we're doing with fundraising in our schools and running a referendum campaign, maybe we're working on a symptom. And maybe it's time for some of us in our community to work on the problem. So I decided to go to that informational meeting, and I don't know how many of you have ever had this volunteering experience, but I went to that meeting promising my husband I was just going to see what it was about. And by the end of that evening, I was the brand new chair of Centennial's brand new legislative action committee. I knew anything about funding. I didn't know anything about politics. I could probably have told you who the president was, and maybe this is how bad it was, maybe who our national senators are. But that's about it. And but we were passionate, and we knew education was important, and we were willing to find out. So a group of 8 of us just charged into what does it mean to be a legislative action committee. And through networking and through finding out what's going on and trying to learn quickly, I came across C, who has been a real good resource to people who want to find out stuff like this. And I ended up now doing this kind of work for 58 school districts instead of just Centennial. So that's my background, and I want to walk us through what I had found out when I was trying to understand what was going on here. And I try to do it in a parent-friendly way, but we'll see if that holds up. But when we talk about education funding and we look to the state for funding our schools, we have to ask ourselves, is it appropriate for the state to fund our schools? And the answer to that is absolutely. Now the Minnesota Constitution, which by the way is the job description for the governor and the legislature, that Constitution only calls out 2 specific areas of government that the state must fund. The first is trunk highway systems, and the other one is found here in Article 13, Section 1. Now I think our Minnesota forefathers really understood what it would take to keep Minnesota prosperous. No matter how much you love Minnesota winters, we will never have a tourist industry that's going to keep our economy rolling along. And we don't, unfortunately, like our neighbors in North Dakota, we're not sitting on a ton of oil. So what we do have and what we have built in Minnesota was this extremely highly educated workforce. I mean, here in Minnesota, we have 16 Fortune 500 companies. That's more than per capita than any other state in the nation. And even more interestingly, most of our Fortune 500 companies are homegrown. We have had this entrepreneurial spirit, we've had our strong university system, and we've had our strong K-12 schools. So our forefathers got it, in my opinion. So in this article, they talk about that the stability of a Republican form of government depends mainly upon the intelligence of its people. So it is the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools. Now duty strikes me as a pretty strong word. It doesn't to me imply, well, you know, at the end of the session, if there's any money left over, maybe you can think about funding your schools. And duty doesn't imply to me that go ahead and do all your pet projects and then come back to education. I mean, duty is a strong word that tells the legislature what they need to do. So it goes on to say the legislature will secure a thorough and efficient system of public schools throughout the state. So when we expect the state of Minnesota to fund our schools, we're not asking them to do something that would be nice to do. We're asking them to do what they're constitutionally obligated to do. I'm going to just slide this. Something's opposite. Okay. It's a little out there, but.
Or is the other engineer would do?
Yeah. There we go. Okay, so it is interesting when you start talking about, well, how are our schools funded? And you know, you usually hear this. Education funding is so complex. There's only 3 people in the entire state of Minnesota who understand it. And those people are Tom Melcher, the finance director down at the Minnesota Department of Education, and a couple fiscal analysts that are buried down in the Capitol. One time I said this, everybody laughed, and I realized they're not really buried, that's where their offices are. But I thought that was funny, maybe you guys didn't catch it. Anyways, but I always think in a way, it almost feels like they're trying to pat us on our head and tell us to just go away because this is too much for you. But I really think we can understand the basics and really get a good idea what's happening to our schools by just following the line. So this is how the state funds education. They have what's called general education aid, and that's the largest share of the state funding, and it is intended to provide the basic financial support for our schools. So within that is this basic formula. That is a per pupil funding that are distributed for every kid who walks through the door. But along the way, the legislature has realized that there are certain categories of kids that are going to need extra help to be successful. So what they do is they set up a category, and then for each child that qualifies, or each district that qualifies, then more money is driven to that district. And I listed them here, but for example, compensatory is another word for children who live in poverty. It's well researched and documented that children who live in poverty do not do as well as their peers unless there's intervention. So the legislature went ahead and set up a category, and then for every child who is on free and reduced lunch, the district gets some more funding for them. Limited English proficiency. We don't even really need the reams of data because it's so intuitive that if a child struggles with the English language, they're probably going to struggle with passing that grad test that they have to pass in order to get their diploma. So if we want our kids to be successful, we better make sure that they're really armed to do well. Extended time, there's reports that have come out that, and I don't know if you hear much about the achievement gap between our students, white students in Minnesota, and our students of color. We have one of the largest achievement gaps in the nation. But there's reports that say 80 to 85% of that achievement gap is attributable to our long 3-month summers, because these kids, what we learn and what we help them get along, and then they're home and they're not getting those educational opportunities that many of our children get because we bring them to museums and we put books in front of them. So, again, that's a category. There's sparsity categories. That's for children who live in geographic isolation. People in rural Minnesota where you can't have the efficiencies of a larger school, and you can't find, because you can't find enough kids in a 4-hour bus route. So there's a lot of the categorical aid. Interesting, though, is what has happened is to fund that basic formula that goes to all our children, it's expensive. It has to go out to 825,000 students. So what the political world then tends to do is figure out how to use those categoricals to drive funding to just one district or a different district, and not all districts. And so what we've seen is that the legislature tends to neglect the basic formula by counting on categorical aids and other ways to drive funding to our schools. I bring this part up because outside of what's called general education aid is more categorical aid. And back in 2003 or 4, there was tough economic times. But we kept hearing they're going to hold education harmless, going to hold them harmless. And the problem is that was true, except they slipped one little word in there. They said we're going to hold general education harmless. And so then what they did is they cut special education and early childhood. Now tell me, if you cut a mandated service, it's not like our schools could say, okay, we're not going to service our special ed kids. They said, oh, okay, we're not getting the money for it, so we have to take it out of general education aid anyways. So those are kind of the beginnings of the shell game that a lot of times we see down at the legislature. But I want to step back to the basic education formula, because truly for C districts, because the way the funding formulas and categoricals work, we don't get much of that other funding. We count on this per pupil formula. And this is really what's intended to put quality in education. From the state's perspective, this is the money that's supposed to be used for the district operating funds. So how does this, well actually let me go into that one more so you understand. This is the money that our districts use to determine how many teachers they can afford to maintain what class sizes. This is the funding that they use to determine what programs we're going to offer. Are we going to have art and music in our elementaries? Are we going to have foreign languages? When are we going to start offering them? Are we going to have advanced placement courses for our kids who want to work at the most rigorous level? And are we going to have those early intervention programs to make sure our struggling students don't get left behind? What extracurriculars are we going to offer? And how much are we going to ask our families to pay? And are we going to have our kids walk 1 mile to school or the legislature sets the amount. And currently, the basic formula amount is $5,124, which has been last year, and if we're really lucky, it'll be that number and not lower for the next couple of years. And then what we do, and this is just the complexity and brings the fun into it, we don't just multiply that how many kids walk through the door, we have to multiply by just marginal cost per bill unit. And what that is that the legislature weights on children differently. So for example, a kindergartner would not bring that whole $5,000 into the district, they only bring 0.6 of it. And that's because traditionally our kindergartners have been half day, but we know more and more now for our at-risk kids, we really need them to be in all-day K, and parents want all-day kindergarten. So if a district wants to compete, a lot of them have to offer that all-day K, even though they don't get the full funding for it. Then we have students in grades 1 through 3 who are about 11% more than a student. And all of this makes sense when I delve into it. I'm like, oh, really? But that was that 80s initiative to really work on our early learners, to get them proficient. And so the way they brought that money is to just beef up how much those kids bring into our district. And then apparently kids in grades 4 through 6 most resemble a kid because they're closest to 1. And finally, in the grades 7 through 12, they're worth 1.3, so you bring in 30% more of that formula. Again, there's historical facts behind it. Traditionally, the textbooks and the labs and all those things start getting much more expensive to do in high school. You have extracurriculars, but we're finding that those maybe aren't really accurate anymore. But that's how it all kind of works out. I don't really think there's a talk about education funding that's complete without talking about this 2001 property tax buy-down. Up until 2001, that basic formula was a combination of state aid, which state money usually is generated through sales tax and income tax. Those are the two biggest pots for the state level. But there used to be a portion of that money that was generated through local property taxes called this general education levy. I was a huge fan of this general education levy for two reasons. First of all, the state, as we know now in these economic times, when the state goes through a bad economy, sales tax and income taxes tank. And so that funding stream is fluctuates a lot. But our property taxes, our property values seem to be much more stable. And we do see some correction now, but traditionally those property taxes are a stable funding source. So that was good to have a little bit of the major funding for our schools in more of a stable environment. The other thing I really liked about the general ed levy is how much we as taxpayers paid into it was based on the property wealth of the state, not our individual district. So if I lived in a $100,000 home here in Northfield or in my Centennial or Minneapolis or Minnetonka or Lake of the Woods, anywhere, I would pay the same amount into this general ed levy through my property taxes. And if I lived in a $500,000 house, I'd be paying more. But the